I would like to welcome everybody to today's program. Today's program is called Naming Your Executor in Honor or Burden. And at the end of this program, perhaps you have to decide, is it in fact an honor or is it a burden? So before we get started, I want to introduce myself. My name is Cody Allen. I'm Senior Vice President and Senior Trust Officer for Northwest Bank's Investment Management Group. Today, we'll be spending some time talking about the different things that we've seen over the years when somebody is named an executor or a trustee for a loved one or a friend or a family member's estate. So let's dive right in. Let's talk about the agenda. The first item we're going to cover is estate planning basics. We're going to go over the basics terminology that you might hear when you walk into your estate planning attorney's office to give you a little bit of information about what am I going to hear? What do I need to think about when I sit down and talk to that estate planning attorney? The next item we're going to talk about is a very broad overview, and I say very broad overview, the difference between a will versus a trust. We have a complete program developed between what is the difference between a trust and a will, but today we're just going to do a high-level overview of the very basic as to why somebody would do a will-based estate plan versus a trust-based estate plan. By the way, there's no right or wrong answers as far as which one you go with, and oftentimes it's not based off the level of assets that you have. Again, we'll go over a very high overview on trust versus wills. The next item, the role of the executor and the trustee, the individual that you're going to name to take care of your estate. Or if you've been named in this role, what are the things that you have to take care of? How does this work? What do you need to do? We'll talk about the different types of hats that executor and trustee has to wear. The next item we'll talk about is after death administration. So what's in step one? What do we need to do as we go through the process? What's the final steps? We'll spend some time talking about that and making sure that you have a high-level overview about the steps that are required as an executor or a trustee. The next item we're going to talk about on the agenda will be common executor pitfalls. What are the things that we've seen executors do over the years where they got tripped up? Maybe it was by accident, maybe it was a lack of knowledge, but we'll spend some time talking about some common pitfalls that we've seen executors fall into. So let's dive right in. Let's talk about estate planning. What is the definition of estate plan? Is normally where we start this conversation. An estate plan, by definition, is the preparation of a plan to carry out an individual's wishes as to the administration and disposition of his or her property before or after his or her death. Okay? The very basic understanding of what an estate plan might be. So let's talk about why does someone estate plan on our next slide. The first bullet point I want to talk about is planning for the distribution of your assets. Meaning that if something happens to us tomorrow, who gets our assets? Is it a charity? Is it an individual? Is it a loved one? We need to make sure that there's a clear indication as to who gets those assets. The next item that we want to talk about is planning for your care while you're incapacitated and planning for end-of-life decisions. Oftentimes we think about estate planning as I've passed away and now what? Who gets my assets? Who's going to settle this process? But one of the most important things to think about is what if I'm incapacitated? Physically, mentally, something's happened. I can no longer take care of things on my own. How do I need to take care of this process? Who's going to take care of it for me? And it's very important to make sure that that type of thought process is carried out. So again, incapacity, not just a death planning process. And last but not least, determine who will be responsible for my estate administration. Will it be an individual? Will it be an organization? Who's going to be that executor? Who's going to be that trustee? These are the three basic things that we think about when we're creating our estate plans. So let's dive in. The next slide, we talk about the basic documents everyone should have when it comes to estate planning. The first thing that I talk about is we need a will. And the will oftentimes states who gets my assets and who's going to administer the after-death administration process. So we need a will. The second item we need is the healthcare power of attorney. Healthcare power of attorney is, again, that situation, physically, mentally, something's happened. We can no longer take care of our own well-being. We need somebody to get healthcare information to ensure that we are being well taken care of on a standard that we would hope to be taken care of. The next item is the living will. This is a clear indication of what we would want our life-sustaining procedures to be if we get in that type of scenario. Again, something's happened to us. We can no longer make these decisions. We need some general documentation that says, if we get in this scenario, here's what I'd like to see happen for me. The last but not least piece is the financial power of attorney. Again, a situation that we have not passed away yet, but we can no longer take care of these decisions, whether it be a physical or mental impairment. We can't maybe write our own checks or make sure our quarterly estimates are done or pay our property taxes. who's going to take care of those things? We need a power of attorney in that seat to take care of those items. These are the 4 basic documents I say every estate plan has to start with. Now we get to be much more complex if we get into a situation of we have a trust or maybe some more advanced planning. But the idea is that every estate plan starts with these 4 key fundamentals. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between a will versus a trust. Again, we have a whole program developed between these differences, but we're going to go over a very broad overview because we hear the terminology and we hear our friends or our family members or our neighbors talking about, well, I have a trust or I have a will. And let's talk a little bit about those basics to make sure we have a good understanding. First of all, why a will over a trust? Why would somebody say, I don't need a trust, I'm going to go ahead and use a will-based estate plan? First of all, it's generally simpler. It's appropriate for smaller estates and or straightforward estates. If we have a clear-cut, simple estate with not a lot of moving parts, a will do just fine. The other 2 criteria kind of fall hand in hand, a defined process to follow with the court system and court oversight. If we're in a situation that we want to make sure that every T is being crossed and I dotted, we can have the court administration process with the probate process of a will. So when that comes into play, we get into a much better scenario of oversight. Again, not a requirement, and this is one of the benefits of having a will versus a trust is that more definitive process and structure. Going to the next topic, why a trust over a will? If you have a more complex planning situation, a trust can be very, very good. Perhaps we have a child or grandchild that's receiving state benefits, and we don't want those interrupted by a big inheritance from his or her family members. We want to make sure that those things are taken care of. A trust can do that. Perhaps we're in a second marriage situation. We want to ensure that our second spouse is taken care of, but at the same time, maybe later down the road, our children from our first marriage gets the assets. Maybe we have a beneficiary that has some spending issues. We know that if he or she receives a large administration or a large dollar amount upon your passing, what are they going to do with that money? That is a situation where a trust could come into play and spell out your wishes very, very clearly. The next item is the private process, and this is a big one. The idea being that if we were to have a will-based estate plan, everything has to be lodged down at the courthouse as far as the assets that you have within 60 to 90 days. A trust, that is not required. There's not a situation that anyone can gain access to your information to determine the assets that you had. We think about the rich and famous and stories that we hear about the assets they may or may not have had when they passed away. They have a trust, that information does not become public. So private process is very, very nice. The third item is, generally speaking, it's a shorter administration process with a trust versus a will. The idea being that that process can be done a little swifter with a trustee versus an executor in that type of situation. These last 2 slides are a very, very broad overview about the difference between a will versus a trust. Again, we have a complete program that's built around this, and we can give some more information about that today, tomorrow, the next day. But in the coming months, we will have another program available that talks about why a trust versus a will, or why a will versus a trust. The next item that we're going to talk about is who oversees the process. So there's 2 terms that we learned when we started talking about estate planning. Who's going to oversee the estate administration process? If it is a will-based estate plan, it will be your executor. An executor, by definition, is a person or institution appointed by a testor to carry out the terms of their will. Trustee, a person or institution given control or power of administration of property in a trust with legal obligation to administer it solely for the purpose specified. Again, these 2 terms can be somewhat used interchangeably. It's based off the type of documents you have. At the end of the day, the executor and the trustee are in a situation that they're going to oversee the process during your after-death administration. Okay? So again, executor versus trustee. Okay? Executors and trustee wear many hats. First of all, they have to understand fiduciary responsibility. And that means that we act with skill and prudence, because when it comes down to it, when you name somebody as your executor or you name somebody as your trustee, they are legally obligated to take the best care that they possibly can of those assets. Ignorance, unfortunately, is not something they can claim as an issue that will allow them off the hook if there's an error that occurs within the after-death administration process. The next item, probate process and probate law. If we have a will-based estate plan, our estate will have to go through probate. And when it goes through probate, we do get in a situation that there's hurdles and steps that we have to accomplish along the way to make sure that things are running smoothly and we're following the court-appointed process. We also have to think about an executor and trustee has to have knowledge of taxation. There's a personal return that likely has to be done when somebody passes away, as well as the estate returns. We'll talk about these more in a little bit, but the idea being that they need to have some understanding about the taxations, the deadlines, and the types of returns that are due. The next thing we talk about is investments. There has to be a level of investment knowledge because at the end of the day, when somebody passes away, they have an investment portfolio, maybe have a brokerage account, maybe they have IRAs, maybe they have a 401k plan. There's a situation that those investments have to be taken care of. And if we get in a scenario that they're not done with skill and prudence, like we talked about earlier, then we get in a situation that that executor or trustee might be legally liable for any kind of losses along that process. We're going to talk a little bit about how we handle the investment process when somebody passes away here in a little bit. The next thing that we want to talk about is an executor and trustee has to have some real estate knowledge. We need to make sure property taxes are being paid. We need to make sure the home's taken care of. We need to make sure that there's a certified appraisal when something does happen. Again, we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but they need to have that hat on to understand what is the process of real estate. There's much, much more that we have to talk about as far as things that executors and trustees have to do, but we're going to keep it high level in this presentation today. These are the biggest items that we think about as far as the administration process. I'm going to throw one shameless plug and then I'll stop with that. But the idea being that when you hire a corporate trustee or executor, we are in a situation that we have the systems in place to handle every conceivable chore of an executor and a trustee. We've done it before. We have processes and systems that handle things quickly, smoothly, and efficiently and avoids potential complications that can either, one, cost the estate money, or two, cost the beneficiaries time and energy and some heartburn about getting the assets to them quickly and efficiently as possible. The next item is that from a shameless plug standpoint is we are examined on a regular basis by the appropriate regulatory bodies. The FDIC and the Iowa Department of Banking conducts regular exams with our book of business to ensure that we're doing things appropriately and efficiently and the way that we're supposed to underneath that fiduciary responsibility rules. Also, last but not least, we are properly insured. Again, a corporate trustee and executor has the ability to do these three things because they've done it before. And that oftentimes saves time, energy, and money. So that's my shameless plug. I'll move on from that. But the idea is that a bank like Northwest Bank and Trust Company can do those things for you. Okay, so let's dive in on a couple different items. The next thing I want to talk about, an executor and trustee are not miracle workers. We have to make sure our assets are titled appropriately. What I mean by that is that occasionally we have seen situations where an individual will say, I've created this revocable trust. However, they've done a poor job of putting their checking accounts and their savings accounts and their investment accounts in the name of this revocable trust. That can cause heartburn as we move through the estate administration process because we are now in a situation that maybe there's a joint ownership situation where the deceased owns a checking account with his or her daughter. When we get in that type of scenario, unfortunately, those assets go to the daughter, even though maybe the father or the mother want those assets to go to the siblings as a whole. So we have to be really careful about, one, not only doing a good job of creating our documents, but two, making sure that our assets are properly titled to ensure that the administration process can run smoothly. Again, if there's questions about that, that's something that we can help tackle. If you're uncertain about, should my checking account be in this name? Should my vehicle be in this name? Should my home be in this name? We'd be most certainly happy to walk you through those steps along the way. Another item that we want to talk to people about, again, is a pitfall that we've seen on occasion, is directed beneficiaries trumps your estate plans. And what I mean by that is that maybe you've gone to all this trouble and thought all this time about creating your will or creating your trust, and you spent time and money and making sure that things are set up appropriately. But when you walk into the bank to open up that IRA, you spend 5 minutes filling out the IRA beneficiary form, and it does not go lock and step with your estate plans. It does not match. It is not in a scenario where they work together. And that is a big problem because that IRA beneficiary form that you took 5 minutes to complete will trump everything that you had done in your estate plans. So, things that we need to talk about. What assets are not distributed under your will? First of all, assets held in joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. If you've created a checking account with maybe your son or daughter on that checking account, when you pass away, that checking account will not go by the wishes of your will or your trust. It will go in joint tenancy, meaning that it'll go to that individual that was on the account with you. And maybe you just added that son or daughter to help write checks. The fact of the matter is that checking account is going to go directly to them. The next item that does not distribute according to your will is a POD designation or a TOD designation. POD is payable on death, meaning that if you pass away and you've named somebody as a payable on death, so let's assume you have a checking account. And with that checking account, you've named your son as the payable on death individual. You pass away, son can walk into the bank and have a death certificate and says, here's the situation, mom or dad are gone. The bank teller is going to look at that and say, okay, you are listed as the payable on death designation, therefore those assets go directly to you. Your will or your trust that you spent time creating will not be included in that process. And sometimes that can be a big, big problem. The next item, proceeds from our life insurance policies. More often than not, we name an individual as a beneficiary of our life insurance. The same thing with our retirement plan benefits and our IRAs. When we get into a situation where we have a beneficiary named on our IRA or our 401k plan or our 403b plan, one of the things that we oftentimes tell people is there's some tax advantage to name an individual rather than your trust or your will, the beneficiary of your retirement plan. That's a different topic for another day. The fact of the matter is that when you fill out that beneficiary form, those beneficiary designations will trump anything that you have within your will or trust. So be very, very careful. Make sure they work together, not away from each other. So questions, let us know. Give us a call. We'd be happy to help in that discussion. So let's talk about the process of the executor. Let's talk about step 1 and step 2 and step 3. First of all, the first thing that we talk about is we want to locate the documents. We want to locate the original trust and will. Not having a photocopy, but indeed the originals will be very, very critical to ensure that those are understood. Let's make sure they're in a safe, secure location that our executor or our trustee will be able to find them very easily. The next thing that an executor has to do is open a probate estate at the courthouse. This is done with the help of an attorney. There will be 2 items that will be needed to start this process and this conversation with the attorney. 1, a certified copy of the death certificate, and 2, the original will. The next thing that we do once we've been appointed is that we name a tax ID number. There's the registration process you can go through online to have a tax ID number assigned to the estate. These are the 3 basic items that we talk about when we say locating the documents. The next thing that we do, and this kind of sometimes works in concert with the whole process of setting up the location of the documents, is securing the residence and the tangible property. Things that we talk to people about oftentimes is within immediately thereafter somebody passing, do we need to change the locks? Do we need to change the home security code? Have we made sure the property taxes have been satisfied? We do not want a property to go to tax sale. That can be a very costly situation if that happens. And then 4, we need to make sure that the home looks lived in. We want to make sure perhaps there's light on every evening, that we've got things on a timer. We want to make sure the lawn's mowed. We want to make sure the snow removal is done. And of course, when we come out of these winter months in the situation that we have a cold, rough winter like we've had this last winter, we want to make sure that home's taken care of. We do not want frozen pipes. We do not want a flooded basement. Those are things that will turn into big, big problems and costly items for the estate. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is make sure that we're securing the resident and its content. We also want to make sure that the property insurance is being paid. Let's make sure that the property insurance, again, is being satisfied and the insurance company is aware if somebody has passed away. The next item that we want is that we don't want mail collecting outside the home. So we want to make sure that we forward the address at the post office. Now, keep in mind, when you notify the post office, don't be surprised if it takes several weeks for that to take hold. Sometimes it's sooner, but we want to make sure that once you've notified the post office, that occasionally you are in a situation that you're having a discussion about somebody running over to the house to ensure any kind of outstanding mail is collected from the mailbox. Because those first few weeks, it still might go to the home. The next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that there's general things being taken care of within the home. Was there a pet? Do we have food within the refrigerator or the pantries that we need to make sure are not going to spoil and cause issues? Do we have a freezer where we have perhaps frozen items that we want to make sure are still running so we don't run into a bad, costly and smelly situation of things being running out of date within the refrigerators and the pantries and the freezers? Very basic thoughts, but again, these are things that we need to think about when we get in this scenario. One of the items I want to make sure that I draw everybody's attention to is, once again, securing the residence and its content. when we do get into a situation that maybe we've had healthcare providers, maybe we've had a neighbor, maybe we've had a friend come over and help do things along the way because somebody's been in a nursing home for a while, or maybe they unexpectedly went to the hospital. We need to make sure that there's not a key floating around of some type of situation that somebody can get their hands on that they shouldn't be. The next thing we want to talk about regarding items on tangible property secure is location of the vehicles. One, we want to make sure the vehicle's insurance has been satisfied. Two, we want to make sure the registration has been satisfied. Oftentimes we do get in situations that we hear maybe grandson or granddaughter or the kids were driving the vehicles once somebody has passed away. We want to try to avoid that as much as possible because suddenly we can get into a lawsuit situation, heaven forbid, if somebody gets into an accident. So you as the executor or trustee, we need to make sure that those vehicles are safe and secure, perhaps put in the garage or perhaps put into your driveway, but we need to not have them on the street driving around. The next item is change insurance, address, and registration information. Let's not have things going to the home anymore. Let's make sure that those items are coming directly to you as the executor. Once we have gotten the vehicle sold, we need to make sure that we cancel both the insurance as well as a notification that registration is no longer in the name of our individual. Again, little details to make sure that the vehicles are being taken care of. We have watched, unfortunately, bad situations happen when that vehicle is once again out there on the road and somebody is incapacitated or passed away. That vehicle should be safe and secure in the garage or in your driveway. The next thing that we want to talk about is opening the lines of communication with beneficiaries. And the way that we do that here is we start with a beneficiary letter. And what goes in that beneficiary letter is a copy of the will or a portion of the trust that alludes to that individual's inheritance. Again, a full copy of the will is something that we send out, or if it's a trust, we only send a portion of the trust that relates to that individual. Once again, it's a private document. Anyone that's not a beneficiary is not entitled to that information. So we want to make sure it's safe and secure. So that's the first thing that goes in that letter. The next thing that we're requesting with the beneficiary letter is we want to obtain addresses for the beneficiaries and contact information. We're also going to need their social security numbers, their date of birth, and we want them to complete a W-9 form. And the reason that we're having this information completed is that there will be tax information that has to be reported at some point in time with those beneficiaries. More on the tax information to come in a little bit, but the idea is that's where we start our line of communication with a letter to the beneficiaries. Next item that we want to talk about is we want to make sure if there was a letter that the individual that has passed away had created that it lists, where do my assets need to go? It's called a letter of direction. Oftentimes we'll see a situation where an individual will sign and date a letter that indicates, where do I want the antique stamp collection? Where do I want the Hummel collection? Or where do I want the, you name it, collection to go to an individual? We want to make sure that's listed right there in that tangible property list called a letter of direction. We'll talk about that more here in a bit. So once we've opened the lines of communication with the beneficiaries, we need to move forward with the estate administration process. Things we have to talk about is legal notifications. This is the next item. So what are the legal notifications and what are the timeframes? First of all, it's called a claims notice, and it has to be filed in a newspaper. There's different requirements by state. Iowa, you have to file a claims notice once a week for 2 weeks. Illinois, once a week for 3 weeks. And the claims period extends for 4 months in Iowa and 6 months in Illinois. So what is this claims notice? It is the ability for us to put something out in the paper that says this individual has passed away, and we are now letting the creditors to know that they need to come forward to ensure that they can claim any kind of legal right they wish to claim on assets that might be involved. Again, if we're in a situation that there's maybe a medical bill, for example, that comes up after the claims period, we really are in a situation that we can draw that line in the sand and say, we're moving on. You had the opportunity to come forward, Mr. and Mrs. Creditor, and you did not. So this is an opportunity to make sure that we're putting some information out there for the world to know that this individual's passed away, and all creditors need to come forward within that 4 to 6 month time frame, depending on which state the individual reside. Next items that we want to talk about is the collection of information and values. So what we want to do is we want to make sure we open up an estate account. We now have that tax ID number assigned. We are now the legal appointee of the estate. We want to make sure we're opening up an account. Maybe it's a checking account, maybe it's a savings account, and it's going to be the account where we dump all the assets into. That might be the checking accounts, the savings accounts, the investment accounts. We're putting those assets directly into that state checking account to ensure that we can easily collect for those items when the time comes, we're ready for the final administration. So we're opening that account underneath the estate's name and tax ID number that was assigned. So we're going to transfer those brokerage accounts. And what we're going to do with that is that we want to first of all determine if any asset should be held or liquidated. We're going to talk about that here in just a moment. The second item we want to do is get a step up in cost basis. What that means is that if we were to pass away today, our new basis that we have for the cost of our investments is the date in which we passed away. So our basis is now today. If we had bought Apple 25 years ago, the basis at that point in time before we passed away was when we bought it back 25 years ago. However, now we're in a situation that step up in basis occurs when we pass away, and the new value is the date in which we passed away. The other thing we want to do with that brokerage account is change the mailing address. Although we may be liquidating the account and sending the assets out, there'll still be final tax return information that we'll need to gain from that brokerage account. So we want to make sure that's going to you instead of to a home that's out there that is no longer being lived in or occupied. The other items we want to do is make sure we're closing out, as I mentioned, the checking accounts and the CDs and the savings accounts. Those CDs, likely are in a situation that they have not matured yet. If you bring in the certified copy of the death certificate, those CDs can be cashed in without any kind of penalties and moved into the estate account. So let's talk about a big question that we get, especially when there's a lot of market volatility going on. It's deciding when to sell and distribute assets. So if we're in a situation that we come upon a brokerage account that the individual has, and we're trying to decide, do we hold on to all these stocks? Do we hold on to all these mutual funds? What should we do with those while we settle this after death administration process? And the comment that we always come back to is, what are we doing as a fiduciary? A fiduciary, what is our liability and our responsibility? Is it to grow the assets or is it to protect the assets? So on this next slide, we have the question, what would you do? So let's throw a hypothetical situation at you. Let's say we've discovered a brokerage account that has approximately $300,000 in assets. And as we've gone along in the estate administration process, we've discovered this estate has about $25,000 in liabilities, and whether it be final medical bills, the attorney costs, maybe an outstanding car loan, we've discovered there's about $25,000 in liabilities. So the question is, which one of these multiple choice questions would you follow? Would you either one, sell just enough to pay those bills and satisfy that $25,000? Would you sell all the brokerage assets, including all those stocks? 3, would you let the broker decide? Would you ask the broker for their professional opinion to say, what would you do in this type of situation? Ask for them for some guidance. Or 4, would you sell the current stocks and bonds and buy new ones that you think are actually better, that you hold maybe in your own portfolio? When we come down to it, we always say the best answer is 95% of the time, I guess you'd say, so maybe not always, but 95, 99% of the time, it is sell all of it. The idea being that it is your responsibility as a fiduciary not to grow the assets, but to protect and maintain the assets. So we want to make sure that we're in a situation that we are protecting those assets. So we don't refer to the broker for their professional opinion. We don't get in a situation to try to buy the right ones, because when we get down to it, you as the fiduciary, you as the executor, are responsible for making sure that those assets are safe and protected. If we get into a situation, and I say maybe the other 1 to 5% of the time, that the beneficiaries of the estate or of the trust are really adamant about the assets being maintained, one of the things that we talk about is you better get a letter of direction assigned by each one of them stating that they will not hold you liable for any kind of situations. Not saying that's going to stop you from being sued some point down the road, but if you decide to hold those stocks, that would be a must-have if I were in your situation and I wanted to hold on to those assets. So, something to think about. The next item that we want to talk about is the collection of asset information and values. Now that we're in a situation that somebody's passed away, we have to put a value on their personal items that they had. This might mean their stocks. Very easy to do because most stocks are valued at a fair market value each day if they're traded over the general exchanges. The next item is real estate. We want to list the services of a certified appraiser. Let's spend the appropriate amount of money to make sure we have a certified appraiser come in and give us a true value on the home. Let's not use the assessor site. Let's not use a realtor's evaluation. Let's have a certified appraiser do that for us. Also, if there's collections, perhaps there's a unique collection and we need to have somebody come into town to do the appropriate appraisal. We've had, I'll give you a few examples of what we've had here at the bank. We've had a marble collector come in from St. Louis. We've had an antique toy collector come in from Chicago. Oftentimes you get in these scenarios to get a true, accurate valuation, you have to have something appropriate done. And sometimes that means venturing outside of the Quad Cities to do it. We also want to make sure that we have a value placed on any kind of autos and boats that are out there. Also, jewelry. Once again, with the jewelry, let's make sure that we're getting a situation where we're going to an actual certified appraiser to have that done. And let's get the written documentation to prove it. All that information is very important to have in the file, not for today, tomorrow, or next day, but 5 or 10 years down the road if questions do come up as to how those valuations were achieved. The next thing we want to do as far as the collection of assets, we want to arrange an appointment to open the safety deposit box. We need to make sure we're getting the contents of that safety deposit box. One of the things that we do here as an institution is we have what's called dual controls when we open up a safety deposit box. What that means is that we have 2 individuals present whenever we open up that safety deposit box. That ensures that we have dual controls. Another thing you might want to do is maybe even videotape the opening of the safety deposit box to ensure that there's appropriate documentation that shows here's actually what was in there the day that I went in there. You certainly don't want to be in a situation that you have to prove later down the road that maybe the grandma's pearls or the stamp collection or the coin collection was not in there. The next thing that we have to do as far as collecting assets is file the life insurance claim. Normally what that takes is filling out the complete life insurance form that's assigned by that individual organization and also a certified copy of the death certificate. Another thing that folks oftentimes forget is let's make sure that there's no assets out there that maybe even the individual themselves didn't know about. So what we always say is go out to the treasurer's site to ensure that you're taking a good look to see if there's any assets that have been cheated back to the state. One of the items we talk about is to take a look at the Great Iowa Treasure Hunts website. You can go to that site, type in an individual's name, and you can take a look to see if there's any assets out there underneath their name. It's really important to find those assets at that point in time rather than 5 years down the road and suddenly you have to open the estate back up and go through the hoops and hurdles of that. Let's talk a little bit more about the real estate process because it's an important one and oftentimes the most time-consuming situation of dealing with an after-death administration of somebody's estate. The first thing that we want to do is we want to make sure we have a certified appraisal. Once again, as I mentioned before, spend the money to have someone that's licensed and do the appraisal. The next item is we want to maybe enlist the services of a realtor. A realtor can also do a fair market appraisal of the house. That gives you a little ability to compare what the certified appraiser has said versus what the realtor feels that it can be sold for. The next thing we want to do is a cleaning service. We want to make sure that we're getting the top dollar that we possibly can for the home. Therefore, we need to have it in the right condition and ready to appeal to the next buyer. The next item that we want to do is locate the abstract and the deed. It's very time consuming and costly to reconstruct these documents. We want to make sure that we can have those in a good location to find them. The next thing we want to do, once again, related to making sure the home looks lived in, as well as making sure that it has the appropriate amount of curb appeal, is let's make sure that the lawn care and snow removal is taken care of. And utility companies. We want to make sure we don't have a lapse in any kind of situation with gas or electric, especially at the wrong time of year. Let's make sure that information is being switched over to your name or switched over to the name of the estate, or eventually then in a situation where turning it off once the property changes hands. So we've talked about the collection information. We're starting to get those assets placed into that checking account we talked about that's in the name of the estate. What's the next step? One of the things that we want to talk about is you have to prepare an inventory for the court. And there's 2 different time frames based off the state you live in. First of all, in the first 90 days, after the appointment as executor in Iowa, you must have an inventory filed with the courts. Again, this is a collection of all the assets, ensuring that we have a valuation of all the assets that were in this estate that we're administering for somebody. In Illinois, instead of 90 days, it is 60 days. So we may have less time to work with. When you start thinking about how quickly that will approach, you'll be very surprised that it doesn't take long for time to spin by, and you're going to be rushing to be able to have the actual appointment filed to the court in a timely manner. So again, 60 days in Illinois, 90 in Iowa for that inventory to be done. The next things we want to do is to make sure that our direct debits and our direct deposits that are going in and out of the checking accounts are being taken care of. These days, most of us are doing things electronically, so we want to make sure that we're taking a look at the statements, like the checking accounts or savings account statements, to ensure we're not going to miss anything. So first of all, notify Social Security. Social Security will automatically pull assets out of the account if somebody received assets they were not due. So that's something that we want to make sure that account stays open to satisfy at least that type of situation if it occurs. Pension plans will oftentimes do the same thing. If a payment has been made and they come to find out that individual was not alive during that month, a lot of times that pension benefit will be recaptured by that pension company. Other items that we want to watch for, investment dividends. Dividends are being direct deposited these days on a very, very reoccurring basis. So we want to make sure that those dividends checks or those direct deposits are being accounted for and that we actually know those stocks exist and where they're at. The other item we talk about besides the situation that we talk about the direct deposits, we want to think about any kind of debits. So it's important for the executor to know the order the bills are paid. So in the event the estate doesn't have enough assets to pay for all the expenses, the distributions to beneficiaries aren't made too quickly, and that we're following the probate law must-have process. So what does probate law require? Who gets paid first when we start talking about expenses? The first item is court costs. So the court wants to be paid first. The second group that must be paid is the other administration. This includes the attorney fees. They are next up to be paid. Then is the funeral expenses. This would be the cost in relation to the funeral home or what have you. The next item is the final medical bills. These are the top 4 expenses that if you paid in order of process, we want to make sure that we don't go through the process of paying off any bills first before we are ready prepared to pay these items as they come about. Other things that we want to change goes on to the next slide, which is we want to make sure any unsecured debt. Maybe there's a credit card out there. Let's cancel that. Let's get that final bill taken care of. And let's make sure that there wasn't a life insurance policy associated with that. Occasionally, credit cards have a small life insurance policy associated to them, and sometimes the individual doesn't even have to pay for it. The next item is cell phone. Let's make sure that cell phone is being taken care of and the final bill is done and the cell phone is accounted for. Debits associated with the residence. Is there a home equity line of credit? Is there a second mortgage? Is there a first mortgage? If we have a situation that the residence needs to be taken care of as far as those bills, let's make sure that those are being paid for as well. Other items associated to the home, don't forget about the utility bills, the homeowner's insurance, the real estate taxes, and the lawn care and snow removal. And of course, if there is cable or internet, what have you, those need to be satisfied as well. Great way and a good thing that we do here is that we'll capture a few months worth of transaction history statements. So what we will do is we'll request several months of transaction history from the bank in which the assets were located. And we will look to ensure that we're not missing any kind of assets. What if there was a dividend coming in from from a stock that we weren't aware of? We want to make sure that's accounted for. What if there was a direct deposit coming in and we're not quite sure what that is? Well, maybe there was a pension out there and the pension maybe has a life insurance benefit to it. We want to look for those things. And that's why we do the review of the transaction history. We also, of course, want to continue or discontinue any kind of automatic withdrawals and ensure those are being satisfied via the estate account. Last but not least, we want to make sure is there any kind of loans that need to be satisfied. Does somebody have a car loan? Do they have a car that's on lease? We want to make sure those types of things are being taken care of as well. The next item, taxes, taxes, taxes. We want to make sure that tax returns are being taken care of. And there's a handful of them. First of all, there's going to be a final personal return with a 1040. This is going to be due April 15th of the year following death. We need to make sure that that is satisfied. The next item is a state inheritance tax return, the Iowa 706 when we're in Iowa. It's due the last day of the 9th month following death. The federal estate tax return, 706 as well, due within 9 months following death. And the last return that we talk about is state fiduciary return form 1041. This is due the 15th day of the 4th month following the close of the tax year. One of the items I talk to people a lot about is let's not go it alone. Let's make sure that we're enlisting the services of an accountant to get these things done. I love the idea of being able to stick with the current accountant. If there is an accountant that has been doing the returns for this individual for years, it works out very nicely to have them do these returns. With that being said, if they're not experts in this, there is definitely a situation that we want to call an accountant that knows their stuff and can take care of these things done in a quick, efficient manner. Please let us know if you have questions. We'd be happy to refer you to the right resources for that. So let's talk a little bit about tax concerns. Oftentimes we get the question of, boy, what is my tax bill going to be when I die? What's going to be the situation the kids have to pay or my estate's going to have to pay? I will say there's a few hurdles that I talk about. And the first one is federal estate taxes. Right now, if you were to pass away in 2021 at this time, you would be in a situation that your estate, as long as it was below $11.7 million, again, $11.7 million, you would pay no federal estate taxes. Okay? 11.7 million or less, no federal estate taxes. And as a married couple, take that times two. So as a married couple right now, effectively your estate could be $23 million or less, and you pay no federal estate taxes. The next item is the Illinois estate tax exemption. It's a little bit smaller than the federal side. If your estate's $4 million or less, there's be no Illinois estate taxes. Okay? Above the 4 million, there is a tax. It's approximately a rate of 16% right now. And at this point in time, those numbers haven't changed for a year or two. Iowa, there's no estate tax. Inheritance taxes for their inheritance taxes for the heirs other than direct descendants. So let's talk about that again. In Iowa, if we're passing directly to our direct descendants, there will be no inheritance taxes. Okay? If we go outside of that direct lineal descent, then we get into a situation that there might be taxes due, and those taxes vary based off of who that's going to. Let us know. We'd be happy to get you those charts. There's a nice little chart that's out there from the state of Iowa that outlines that information. So let's talk about a few hurdles, some things that we see come up that cause heartburn for not only the executor, but also the beneficiaries. One of the ones that we like to talk about is paying specific bequests and distributions. When should you pay them and who gets paid first? So in this example, we're going to talk about, I have passed away and I want to give $75,000 to my good neighbor, Steve. I want all the remainder of my assets to go to my daughter, Ann. So let's talk about what happens in this situation. Let's say that Ann says, hey, I really need to have some money to come back for the services, for the funeral. I want to be there. Can you cut me a check for $5,000 for me to be able to come home? Now, in that type of situation, you might look at the checking account and it looks like it's flush with cash. So therefore you assume there's other assets out there and very little debt. Come to find out, as you work through the estate administration process, there was only $50,000 in assets. Now suddenly we have paid Ann out of order. We have paid Ann first, and who should have been paid first is Steve. So that $50,000 in the overall estate should have all gone to Steve, and Ann would have gotten nothing because, again, the remainder went to Ann, and Steve should have been paid first. So we want to be really careful about the timing of when we pay those distributions out. We see this conversation come up quite a bit, especially when we're in a situation that beneficiaries are asking for distributions prior to the final administration being done. Another thing that we run across that causes a lot of heartburn is the tangible property. Who's going to get mom's Hummel? Who's going to get the good china? Who's going to get the stamp collection? We get into a lot of scenarios, not necessarily when the monetary side comes into play, but it's the tangible items where families start to bicker. So things that we see have done. First of all, what we like to see is a letter of direction from the individual. And what we mean by that is that that letter of direction says, I want the stamp collection to go to Jane. I want the coin collection to go to John. That type of clarity, and in a letter that's signed and dated, doesn't have to be notarized, doesn't have to be signature guaranteed, but that type of clarity makes things much, much easier when the time comes for the after-death administration process. Again, that letter of direction is a big deal. It should be kept with your current estate planning documents, and it is a lifesaver in a lot of situations. Do not put little sticky notes on certain items in the home, like the vase collection or what have you. Those things tend to disappear. Put your wishes in that letter of direction for those small tangible items. The letter of direction isn't going to be your estate plan, but it is a good thing for those little items that need to be taken care of in the home. If we get into a scenario where there's not a letter of direction and the family can't get along, one of the things that we recommend is that there's the ability to go out and obtain a valuation of all the things in the home. Once that valuation is done, then there could be a situation of a bit of an agreement where of equal value, family members can take items and you go through an ordering sequence. If there's 4 children, 1 through 4, they draw straws and they work through the process of taking items of equal value, whether it take 1 or 2 items or more to accomplish that equal value. If that doesn't work, the other item that you can remedy to is an auction agreement, which basically states if everyone can't get along, we're going to send everything to auction. And when whoever wants to bid on an auction can go ahead and do that. And if you get an auction, that's great. If you don't, well, it's too bad. The money's going to the estate. So in this type of situation, A lot of times the bickering happens on the tangible property, not the monetary value. Those are a few items that we've seen folks use as a tool to get around that bickering process. So if we've gone through the process of establishing our estate account and we're funneling assets into that checking account and we're paying bills and we've done the inventory and the home's in good shape, now we're starting in the process of the final accounting. What does the final accounting mean that you need to provide to the beneficiaries in the court? First of all, it's a statement of transactions from the date of death. This is where it comes in really handy to have only one account that is receiving all the assets and one account that is paying out all the bills. Having that one single account to accomplish all of that makes it so much easier and nice and tidy for not only the beneficiaries, but for the court to see. The next item is the proposed distribution schedule. Based off the terms that you're reading within the document, who gets what? Is it a percentage? Is it a dollar amount? Where do things land? The next item is we need to obtain the beneficiaries' W-9s and complete a verification of their tax ID numbers. When we're in a situation that you have a beneficiary that's receiving these assets, we want to make sure that we're in a situation that we have their tax ID number to ensure that the taxes are properly being reported. All right, so we're in the home stretch and we're continuing to get to the final process. What else do we need to do? We need to reflect a little bit. Is the claims period over? Have we gone to that 4 to 6 month window, depending on the state that we're in that we're talking about earlier? Has that expired? Have all court costs been paid? Have we satisfied the courts? Again, our attorney can help us in that discussion. Are there any outstanding bills? Did those creditors come forward? Who do we need to pay? Who do we not? Where do we stand today? Has a tax acquittance been received? This is one that folks hate to wait for, but it's important. Tax acquittances are taking a while for us to receive those back right now because there's a lot of things going on with Uncle Sam. But that being said, it is critical for you to wait for that tax acquittance to come in. Has court approval been received? Once again, that final step in the process, the court will approve the probate process and allow you to close things out. So how long does all this take? Once we've gone through this and we've double-checked things and we've triple-checked things, how long does this entire process take? When the beneficiaries start asking us in week 1 or week 2 about when they're going to get their money, one of the things that we often tell folks is give them a realistic time frame. Don't set yourself up for failure. Make sure that you're giving yourself a time frame that's realistic. And our comment is a realistic time frame is between 12 to 18 months. That is not uncommon, especially for an estate that's in a situation that has real estate. So 12 to 18 months for a will-based estate plan to go through probate. A big difference that will play into this is an executor's experience. If we have an executor that knows what they're doing and knows how to travel this process, it makes things much quicker, smoother, and much less painless. Again, maybe a shameless plug, but making sure that you've got an executor that is up to handling these tasks is critically important. A few other items I want to touch on before we let you go today is some common errors that we see inexperienced executors make. First of all, allowing access to a residence too early. We oftentimes hear that family member that wants to go in and look for the pearls or looks for the diamond earrings or what have you. We want to make sure that we don't allow that individual to go in and look for those items, especially if we don't know if they're entitled to them just yet. So stay resilient, make sure that you're stay fast and you don't get into a situation that you allow somebody to get in that home too early. Also, premature distribution of assets. Again, my example I gave earlier of somebody that wants to travel back for the services, we want to make sure that we're not giving them assets that maybe they're not entitled to. Maybe there's going to be too much in expenses and nobody's going to get an inheritance. So we want to be careful about making distributions too early. Also, the failure to consider estate and inheritance expenses. Once again, there's expenses that are associated with the estate administration process. Do not cut the estate too short because once again, the common theme that I'm talking about is you as the executor or you as the trustee, there is responsibility that you have a legal liability to take care of these things. Last but not least, if we don't wait for our tax clearance or acquittance, we could get into a scenario where we distributed assets and Uncle Sam's saying, hold the phone, there's more taxes owed. And now either you're trying to claim assets that are no longer there because the beneficiaries have spent them, or you have beneficiaries that have some heartburn with your request to have some of those dollars back. The last item that I want to talk about is how often should I update my estate plan? We get this question a lot. Should I visit my attorney every year or every 2 years? I often say it most of the time bases off of life-changing events. What I mean by that is that there been a marriage, has there been a divorce, a birth, a passing? If we're in a situation that something like that has happened, those are the times in which I say we definitely need to go talk to our attorney. Now, occasionally there's going to be regulatory changes that do influence our estate planning needs. And occasionally that is going to happen. And we want to make sure that if that does happen, we're picking up the phone and having a conversation with our attorney to determine are the revisions that need to be made. So maybe that's a conversation as you see things come up. We'll try to make sure that if you're a client of ours, that we're informing you of those things. But at the end of the day, every several years, maybe every 2 years, to pick up that phone and have that conversation with that attorney, it doesn't hurt to ask, is there something that I need to think about that I had not worried about at that point in time when we drew up my documents? Okay. So the answer to that is as need be. So that's the program today. Once again, I go back to the question of, after talking about all these different items and all these different tasks and the hats that an executor has to wear, is it considered an honor or burden to name somebody as your executor in this type of situation? We'll continue to send out more programs. Our next programs, once again, will be more based on trust work. What is the difference between a will and trust? Why would anybody create a trust? And we'll go over some of those items in more depth. Today's program, once again, naming an executor, an honor or burden. I'll leave it up to you to decide. I hope everybody enjoyed today's program. Please feel free to contact us with questions and take care.